The rumble started before dawn, a sound like distant thunder that never stopped rolling closer. Kevin stepped outside his apartment and froze. 250 motorcycles filled the street, engines idling in perfect silence as leather-clad strangers turned to look at him. A banner hung above the diner door with his name on it. He had no idea why. 3 weeks earlier, standing behind a half-open kitchen door, he'd heard his own son call him worthless, a burden nobody knew what to do with. He'd told no one, but somehow an entire community already knew, and they had come to answer that word with 250 engines and a truth his family had forgotten. The autumn light over Knoxville came in low and orange, sliding through the blinds of a one-room apartment above a hardware store on Magnolia Avenue. Kevin Sullivan sat at his kitchen table, a cup of instant coffee going cold in front of him, and read the same newspaper page for the third time without absorbing a word. He was 79 years old, and most days that felt like a number stapled to him rather than a life he'd lived. His hands, thick-knuckled and scarred from 40 years bent over engine blocks, trembled slightly now when he lifted the cup. Parkinson's, the doctor said, though Kevin preferred not to say the word out loud. Saying it made it real, and he had enough real things to carry. The apartment held almost nothing of the man he used to be. A single photograph, curling at the corners, showed a younger Kevin in army fatigues, squinting into a Vietnamese sun in 1969, his arm slung around a buddy who hadn't made it home. Another photograph, in a cheap frame from the dollar store, showed his late wife, Linda, on their wedding day, 40 years and one funeral ago. Everything else, the house they'd built together on Sutherland Avenue, the garage where he'd fixed half the cars in the neighborhood, the tools he'd spent a lifetime collecting, belonged to someone else now. It had happened quietly, the way most losses do. 2 years after Linda passed, Kevin's memory had started slipping in small, frightening ways. Forgetting to pay the electric bill, leaving the stove on, getting turned around on streets he'd driven for 50 years. His son Gregory had stepped in, and Kevin had been grateful at first. Gregory was a successful man, a regional manager for an insurance firm with a big house in Farragut, and a wife, Denise, who wore tennis whites even when she wasn't playing tennis. Gregory had power of attorney drawn up just to help with the paperwork. He'd suggested selling the house just until things settled down. He'd found Kevin this apartment, just temporary. That had been 3 years ago. Kevin folded the newspaper and looked around the small room, the water-stained ceiling tile, the space heater that rattled when it ran, the mini-fridge that hummed too loud in the silence. He thought about calling Gregory, then thought better of it. The last time he'd called, Gregory had been short with him, distracted, his voice carrying the particular weariness of a man managing an obligation rather than loving a father. The worst of it hadn't been the apartment or the missing furniture or even the house. The worst of it had happened 3 weeks ago at Tyler's 16th birthday party. Kevin had shown up in his good flannel shirt, carrying a card with $40 folded inside. All he could spare from his Social Security check that month. He'd stood awkwardly near the drink table, while Gregory's colleagues from the insurance office mingled with relatives Kevin barely recognized anymore. At some point, he'd overheard Gregory in the kitchen talking to Denise, unaware his father was close enough to hear through the half-open door. "I don't know what to do with him anymore," Gregory had said, his voice pitched low but not low enough. "He can't remember what day it is half the time. He shows up looking like he slept in his clothes. Honestly, Denise, he's worthless at this point. He just sits there." Denise had murmured something Kevin couldn't make out, and Gregory had laughed, a short, humorless sound. I know, but what am I supposed to do? Put him on a shelf?" Kevin had set down his half-finished cup of punch, walked out the front door without saying goodbye to anyone, and driven his old Ford pickup, one of the few things still legally his, back to the apartment above the hardware store. He hadn't cried. He wasn't sure he had it in him anymore. He'd simply sat at the kitchen table until the light went from gold to grey to black, turning that single word over and over in his mind. Worthless. He thought of the men he'd carried on stretchers through rice paddies in 1969. He thought of the 18-year-old private who'd bled out in his arms while Kevin pressed both hands against a wound that wouldn't close, whispering promises he couldn't keep about going home. He thought of the 40 years he'd spent making sure every car that left his garage was safer than when it came in, because he'd learned early that carelessness cost lives. He thought of Linda and the way she used to say that Kevin Sullivan was the most reliable man God ever put breath into. Worthless. Now, 3 weeks later, Kevin still hadn't told anyone what he'd heard. He hadn't gone back to Gregory's house. He'd made excuses. A cold, a doctor's appointment, tiredness, and Gregory hadn't pushed, which told Kevin something too. His only routine left was breakfast at Delaney's Diner, 4 blocks down, where he'd been a regular for 15 years. He pulled on his jacket, the same worn brown one he'd had since the Clinton administration, and stepped out into the cool morning, telling himself it was just another Tuesday. He had no way of knowing that in less than a month, 250 motorcycles would fill the street outside that diner because of what someone was about to overhear. Nicole Bennett had been working the morning shift at Delaney's Diner for 6 years, ever since she'd moved back to Knoxville after her father died. She knew the rhythms of the place the way she knew her own pulse, the hiss of the griddle, the particular creak of the second booth from the door, the regulars who came in like clockwork and left like ghosts if you didn't pay attention. Kevin Sullivan was one she always paid attention to. He came in most mornings around 8, ordered the same thing, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee, and usually sat alone at the counter, reading whatever section of the newspaper someone had left behind. He was polite in the old-fashioned way, always said please and thank you, always left a $1 tip even though Nicole suspected he could barely spare it. She'd noticed over the past few months that his hands shook more, that his jacket hung looser on his frame, that something in his eyes had dimmed. She hadn't known why until 3 weeks ago, when Kevin had come in looking like a man who'd been hollowed out overnight. He hadn't said much, just ordered his usual, and stared at the counter for the better part of an hour. But Frank Delaney, the diner's owner, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s who'd served in the Marines and kept a small American flag by the register, had pulled Nicole aside afterward. "You know Kevin's boy has power of attorney over him," Frank had said, voice low. "My cousin does title work downtown. Said the son sold the Sutherland house 18 months ago. Old man never even got to keep the tools from his garage. Just gone. And I heard from Ruth at the pharmacy that the boy's been talking bad about him around town, calling him a burden." Nicole had felt something tighten in her chest. Her own father, Sergeant First Class Robert Bennett, had served 2 tours before coming home with a limp and a purple heart he never talked about. He died 4 years ago, and the last months of his life, when his body had started failing him, Nicole had moved back to Knoxville to care for him herself, refusing every suggestion that she place him in a facility and forget about him. She knew, with a certainty that lived somewhere below language, exactly what a man like her father, or a man like Kevin, deserved in his final years. It wasn't a shelf. It wasn't an apartment above a hardware store and a family too embarrassed to claim him. Nicole was also a volunteer with the Steel Guardians, a local chapter of veteran motorcyclists who spent their weekends doing charity rides, escorting funerals for fallen service members, and raising money for veterans in crisis. She'd joined 2 years after her father's death, needing somewhere to put the grief that had nowhere else to go. The club's president, Marcus Reed, was a 58-year-old former Army sergeant who ran a small construction company and treated every veteran in Knox County like family, whether he'd met them or not. That evening, after her shift ended, Nicole drove to the clubhouse, a converted auto body shop off Rutledge Pike, and found Marcus in the back office going over paperwork for an upcoming charity ride. "I need to tell you about someone," she said. She told him everything Frank had told her, and everything she'd pieced together herself from watching Kevin's slow unraveling over the past months. A man who'd served his country, worked with his hands for 4 decades, and was now being erased by his own son, one small cruelty at a time. She told him what she'd overheard second-hand, filtered through Frank, about Gregory Sullivan calling his father worthless in his own kitchen, loud enough for guests to hear. Marcus listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening with every detail. When Nicole finished, he was quiet for a long moment, turning a pen over in his scarred fingers. "Sullivan," he said finally. "Kevin Sullivan, Vietnam. That's what Frank said. 68 to 70. Marcus set the pen down and reached for an old 3-ring binder on the shelf behind him, a record the club kept of local veterans they'd assisted or honored over the years. He flipped through it methodically until he stopped on a page and went still. "I know this name," he said slowly. "Not from the war, from after." He turned the binder around so Nicole could see. It was a newspaper clipping, yellowed at the edges, from 1994, a feature on local businesses that gave back to the community. There was a photograph of a younger Kevin Sullivan standing in front of his garage, arms crossed, grinning. The caption explained that Sullivan's Auto Repair had, for over a decade, fixed cars for free for any Knox County veteran who couldn't afford the bill. No questions asked. "My Uncle Ray used to talk about a mechanic on Sutherland who fixed his truck for nothing when he came back messed up from Desert Storm and couldn't hold a job," Marcus said. "Never told him his name, just said the man never let a vet pay a dime." He looked up at Nicole. "You're telling me that's the same man sitting alone in a diner right now, and his own son thinks he's worthless?" "That's what I'm telling you." Marcus closed the binder. Something had shifted in his face. Not anger exactly, but a kind of resolve Nicole had seen only twice before, both times right before the club organized something enormous. "Get me everything you can find out about this man," he said, quietly. "I don't want him knowing yet. And Nicole, call every chapter you know. Tennessee, Kentucky, Georgia, the Carolinas. I think it's time Kevin Sullivan found out what his community actually thinks he's worth." Over the next 2 weeks, Kevin's world continued to shrink in the way it had been shrinking for years, one small indignity at a time. Gregory called twice, brief, distracted calls that lasted less than 3 minutes each. Once to say he couldn't make it to Kevin's birthday dinner because of a work conference in Nashville. Once to ask whether Kevin had signed the paperwork for a Medicaid application Gregory had mailed him. Paperwork that would, if Kevin was honest with himself, formalize just how little control he had left over his own life. He signed it. What else was there to do? He'd spent his whole life being the dependable one, the man who fixed what was broken, who showed up on time, who kept his promises. Now the machinery of his own family had quietly decided he was the broken thing, and there was no fixing broken things. There was only managing them, storing them, waiting for them to stop being a problem. He didn't tell Frank Delaney or Nicole Bennett what he'd overheard at Tyler's birthday party, though he suspected from the careful gentleness in the way they both treated him lately that they knew something. Frank had started comping his coffee on the house more often than felt natural. Nicole had begun sitting with him for a few minutes during slow stretches, asking him questions about the war, about his marriage, about the garage he used to run, questions nobody had asked him in years. He found himself talking more than he had in a long time. He told her about Private Danny Osei, the 18-year-old from Cleveland who died in his arms outside Da Nang. He told her about coming home to a country that didn't want to look at him, and how Linda had been the only person who ever really did. He told her about the garage, about the years he'd spent under the hood of half of Knox County's vehicles, about the veterans who'd walked in with their tails between their legs, ashamed to ask for help, and how he'd made it a rule, no charge, no questions, no pity, just a fixed car and a handshake. Why'd you do that? Nicole asked him one grey Tuesday morning, refilling his coffee though he hadn't asked. Kevin considered the question for a while. Because somebody should have done it for me, he finally said. Nobody did. I figured I could be the somebody for the next guy. Nicole had to excuse herself to the kitchen after that, and when she came back her eyes were a little red, though she blamed it on onions. What Kevin didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, sitting at that counter with his shaking hands wrapped around a coffee mug, feeling like a man slowly being erased, was that his name was now traveling through a network he'd never known existed. Text messages and phone calls moved between motorcycle clubs across 4 states. Old military records were pulled. Veterans who remembered Sullivan's auto repair, some of whom hadn't thought about that free brake job or that no-charge transmission repair in 20 years, were being tracked down and told what was happening. Marcus Reed made calls late into the night, coordinating with club presidents in Chattanooga, Nashville, Asheville, and as far as Charlotte. He spoke with the local VFW post, the American Legion, and a non-profit that helped elderly veterans with housing. Nicole, meanwhile, quietly gathered whatever documentation she could, old newspaper clippings from the Knoxville News Sentinel archives at the public library, a copy of Kevin's DD-214 that Frank had, strangely enough, once helped him request years ago for a VA appointment, and kept a photocopy of just in case. They learned things Kevin himself might have forgotten to mention, too humble to bring them up. A Bronze Star for actions during an ambush in 1969, when Kevin had, under fire, dragged 2 wounded soldiers to safety after their patrol was hit. A commendation from the city of Knoxville in 1998 for the Veteran Auto Assistance Program he'd run out of his own garage for over a decade, entirely unfunded, entirely on his own dime. None of it had ever translated into money or comfort or a family that saw him as anything but a burden in his old age. By the 3rd week, Marcus had a plan, and it was bigger than anything the Steel Guardians had done before. He wanted to gather every rider willing to make the trip, not just from Knoxville, but from clubs across the region who owed something, directly or indirectly, to men like Kevin Sullivan. He wanted them to arrive not with anger, but with honor, a procession. A public reckoning, gentle but undeniable, that would make it impossible for anyone, Gregory Sullivan included, to call Kevin worthless ever again. "We do this on a Saturday," Marcus told the assembled club members at the clubhouse, a whiteboard behind him covered in notes. "Outside Delaney's diner, where he eats every morning. We tell him what he means to this community. We tell his son, if he shows up, exactly what kind of man he's been treating like garbage." "What if the son doesn't come?" someone asked. Nicole, sitting near the back, answered before Marcus could. "He'll come," she said, "because by Saturday, half of Knoxville is going to know what he said about his father, and men like Gregory Sullivan care more about how things look than almost anything else in the world." She was right, though not one of them could have known just how right, or how the coming Saturday would end up changing not just Kevin Sullivan's life, but his son's as well. Kevin woke that Saturday morning to a sound he couldn't place at first, a low, distant rumble that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, vibrating faintly through the floorboards of his apartment. He sat up in bed, heart hammering the way it did more easily now than it used to, and listened. It sounded like thunder that wouldn't stop rolling. He dressed slowly, his hands more unsteady than usual, and made his way down the narrow staircase to the street. The moment he stepped outside, the sound resolved into something he understood immediately, something buried deep in muscle memory from a lifetime of standing in his own garage, listening to engines the way other men listened to music. Motorcycles, dozens of them. Then he turned the corner toward Delaney's diner and stopped walking altogether. The street was full of them, chrome and leather and flags snapping in the October wind, engines idling in a low chorus that seemed to fill the entire block. Riders in leather vests covered in patches stood beside their bikes in loose, orderly rows that stretched from the diner all the way past the old shoe repair shop 2 blocks down. American flags, POWWMIA flags, vests marked with unit patches from wars Kevin recognized and some he didn't. Men and women, young and old, black and white, all standing quietly, almost reverently, as if waiting for something, waiting for him. Nicole appeared at his side before he could fully process what he was looking at, her hand light on his elbow. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, and there was something thick in her voice. "These people came here for you." "For me?" Kevin's voice came out smaller than he intended. "Nicole, I don't understand." Marcus Reed stepped forward from the crowd, removing his sunglasses, his weathered face solemn. Behind him, Frank Delaney had propped the diner's door open, and a small hand-painted banner hung above it. "Welcome home, Kevin Sullivan." "Mr. Sullivan," Marcus said, his voice carrying easily over the idling engines, which seemed to quiet, almost in unison, as if the riders had rehearsed it. "My name is Marcus Reed. I'm president of the Steel Guardians Motorcycle Club. 250 of us rode here today, some from as far as North Carolina, because we heard what was said about you, and we came to tell you, in front of God and this whole city, that you were lied to." Kevin felt his throat close. He looked at the sea of faces, most of them strangers, all of them watching him with an intensity he hadn't felt directed at him in years. Not pity, he realized slowly, but respect. "We know about Da Nang," Marcus continued. "We know about the Bronze Star you never talk about, and the 2 soldiers you carried out of an ambush under fire when you were 20 years old. We know about Sullivan's Auto Repair and the 14 years you spent fixing cars for free for every broke, struggling veteran who walked through your door and couldn't pay a dime. No questions asked. No charity you ever wanted credit for." He paused. "My Uncle Ray was one of those men, Desert Storm veteran, came home broken, couldn't hold a job, and you fixed his truck for free so he could get to work and keep what little dignity he had left. He talked about you for the rest of his life, and he never even knew your name until 3 weeks ago." A murmur ran through the crowd. Riders nodding, some wiping at their eyes. "You gave to this community for 40 years and asked for nothing back," Marcus said, his voice thickening. "And somewhere along the way, the people who should have protected you decided you were worthless." He let the word hang in the cool morning air, heavy and deliberate. "We're here to tell you that word is a lie. It was always a lie." Kevin's legs felt unsteady beneath him. Nicole's hand tightened on his elbow, steadying him. He opened his mouth to speak and found he had no words at all, only the burning pressure behind his eyes that he hadn't let himself feel in 3 weeks, not since Tyler's birthday party, not since he'd stood on the other side of a half-open kitchen door and heard his own son call him a burden. It was at that moment that a silver Lexus turned onto the street and stopped hard, unable to go further because of the wall of motorcycles blocking the block. Gregory Sullivan stepped out, dressed for a Saturday errand in a polo shirt and khakis, his face a mixture of confusion and dawning alarm as he took in the scene, the flags, the leather vests, the banner, and his father standing in the middle of it all, visibly shaking. "Dad!" Gregory called out, pushing through the edge of the crowd, riders parting reluctantly to let him through. "What is this? What's going on?" Frank Delaney, standing near the diner entrance, spoke before Kevin could. "This is what happens, Greg, when a man spends his whole life giving to people and his own family throws him away." Frank's voice was calm, but there was an edge underneath it that made Gregory flinch. "Your father fixed cars for free for veterans for 14 years, saved lives in Vietnam, and you told your wife he was worthless, loud enough for half your son's birthday party to hear it through the kitchen door." Gregory's face drained of color. His eyes flicked to his father, then to the crowd, then back to his father, and Kevin watched something he hadn't seen in his son's face in a very long time. Shame, real and unguarded, stripped of the careful management Gregory usually brought to every interaction. "Dad," Gregory said again, quieter now, and his voice cracked. I didn't mean—" "You meant it," Kevin said, finding his voice at last. It came out rougher than he intended, but steadier than he expected. "You meant it, Gregory. I heard you say it. I've heard it in my head every day since." The street had gone almost silent. 250 engines idling low, 250 strangers watching a father and son face each other in a moment neither of them had asked for, and neither could now avoid. For a long moment, nobody moved. Gregory stood frozen in the space between his father and the crowd of riders, his khakis and polo shirt suddenly absurd against the backdrop of leather and chrome, his careful, image-conscious life laid bare in front of 250 strangers who had ridden hundreds of miles for a man he'd dismissed in his own kitchen. "I've been trying," Gregory finally said, his voice unsteady. "I've been trying to handle everything. The house, the bills, your care. And I know I haven't done it right. I know I haven't visited enough. But Dad, I never stopped." He faltered. "I never stopped loving you. I just didn't know how to be around you anymore after Mom died, after you started forgetting things. It scared me. Watching you get older scared me. And I didn't know what to do with that fear, except push it away. I'm not proud of what I said. I've hated myself for it since I said it." Kevin studied his son's face for a long moment, really looked at him, the way he used to look at an engine that wasn't running right, searching for the source of the trouble rather than just the symptom. He saw, underneath the shame, something he recognized. A man who had been afraid and had let that fear curdle into cruelty because he didn't have better tools to handle it. It didn't erase what had been said, but it made it human, in a way that pure cruelty wouldn't have been. "I'm not worthless, Gregory," Kevin said, and his voice, though quiet, carried across the silent street. "I never was. I raised you. I built a business that helped this whole community. I served this country when I was younger than Tyler is now, and I carried men out of fire so they could go home to their own fathers. Whatever's happening to my memory now, whatever's happening to my hands—" He held them up, watching them tremble slightly in the cool October light. "That doesn't erase 40 years of a man's life. It doesn't make him garbage to be stored somewhere until he's convenient to think about again." Gregory's eyes were wet now, unashamed of it in front of the crowd. "You're right," he said. "You're right, Dad. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Marcus Reed stepped forward then, breaking the tension with the practical gentleness of a man who'd spent years helping veterans and their families navigate exactly this kind of raw, unresolved grief. "Mr. Sullivan," he said to Gregory, not unkindly, "your father has a community now that isn't going anywhere. We'd like that to include you, too, if you're willing to be part of it, the right way this time." What followed over the next hour was something Kevin would replay in his mind for the rest of his life. The Steel Guardians had not come only to make a statement. Marcus revealed that the club, working with the local VFW Post and a regional veterans housing non-profit, had raised enough money over the past 2 weeks to secure Kevin a small, fully accessible one-bedroom cottage near the clubhouse, rent covered for 2 years through a Veterans Assistance Fund, with home health visits arranged through the VA. A separate collection, passed hat to hat among the riders that very morning, had raised over $11,000, presented to Kevin in a worn cigar box that Frank Delaney had kept behind the diner counter, specifically for the occasion. Kevin wept then, openly, for the first time since Linda's funeral, not from sorrow, but from the almost unbearable relief of being seen. Nicole stood beside him through all of it, and later, as the crowd began to thin and riders drifted into the diner for the free breakfast, Frank insisted on serving everyone. She sat with Kevin at his usual spot at the counter, the two of them quiet amid the noise. "Why'd you do all this?" Kevin asked her. "You didn't have to." Nicole thought about her father, about the months she'd spent caring for him, about all the things she wished someone had told him before he died. That his service mattered, that his sacrifice was seen, that he was never, not for one day, a burden. "Because somebody should," she said, echoing his own words back to him from weeks before. "Nobody did it for my dad in time. I figured I could be the somebody for the next guy." Kevin reached over and covered her hand with his own, steadier now than it had been in weeks. 3 months later, Kevin Sullivan moved into his small cottage near the Steel Guardians clubhouse, decorated with photographs old and new. Linda on their wedding day, Danny Osie's name inscribed on a small memorial plaque Marcus had commissioned, and a new picture taken that October morning of Kevin surrounded by 250 riders and their machines, his hand raised, his face lit with something that hadn't visited it in years. Gregory visited every Sunday now, sometimes bringing Tyler, who had begun asking his grandfather questions about Vietnam, about the garage, about the kind of man he wanted to grow up to be. It wasn't perfect. There were still hard conversations, still old wounds that needed tending, but it was honest in a way their relationship hadn't been in a long time. And every Tuesday morning, without fail, Kevin still walked the 4 blocks to Delaney's Diner, where Nicole poured his coffee before he even asked, where Frank still refused to let him pay, and where an entire community had made him understand, finally and completely, that the word whispered against him in a stranger's kitchen had never once been true. He had never been worthless. He had simply been waiting for the people who could see it.